Hello and welcome back to the channel. If you're new here, hi, you are very welcome. This is Reading the Past and I'm Dr. Cat. Recently, and with increasing regularity, I've had requests in the comments for a video on Eleanor of Aquitaine. I've wanted to cover her on this channel for quite some time, and so this has just been the push that I needed. So, without any further ado, let's take a look at her life and legacy. Eleanor was most likely born in the early half of the 1120s, the year commonly offered being 1122, but the exact date and indeed location of her birth has gone unrecorded, or at least not recorded well enough to leave a record for us to use today. Eleanor's mother, Eleanor, and her brother Guillaume had both died before Eleanor was out of her mid-teens at the latest. And although no record survives which gives us details of Eleanor's education, I think it's safe to assume that she would have been given a fitting schooling for her status and for her likely future life, based upon the options that were available to her. Later evidence from her life does make it clear that Eleanor had been taught to read Latin, and it also seems that she had developed a defining interest in both education and literary endeavours. Now, while assertions that Eleanor would preside over a court of love and be a special supporter of troubadours and romance writers is something that's been challenged by later scholars, she, like many members of her family, was certainly an important patron of literature. Her tomb effigy at Fontevraud shows her reclining with an open book in her hands. Eleanor's father, for whom her brother was named, was also called Guillaume. He was 8th Count of Poitou and 10th Duke of Aquitaine. He died during the Easter week of 1137 at the important pilgrimage site of Santiago de Compostela. Eleanor and her lone surviving sibling, her younger sister Petronella, were thus left as orphans. As Eleanor was her father's eldest surviving child, she was his inheritrix. Eleanor became Duchess of Aquitaine in her own right, or as the Latin would have it, sua jure. In her new role, she was in possession of an enormously valuable and large collection of lands. Eleanor and this inheritance, I think understandably, drew the interest of a number of high-ranking families, all of whom were keen to marry one of their sons to this very wealthy duchess. As it was, the Capetian royal family of France would waste little time. Towards the end of July 1137, so just a few months after her father's death, Louis VI of France arranged for her to marry his eldest surviving son, who was also called Louis. And even though young Louis's father was still alive, Eleanor's new husband had been consecrated as King Louis VII a few years before their marriage by Pope Innocent II on the 25th of October 1131. We get a sense of the importance of this marriage for Louis when we take a look at a map like this one, because it gives us an idea of the size of the duchy that Eleanor brought to her marriage. Clearly, I think, Louis VII recognised and was proud of this marital acquisition, as he willingly allowed it to become a differentiated part of his royal style. As Jane Martindale explains, there was, quote, the dual title of King of the French and Duke of the Aquitanians, Rex Francorum et Dux Aquitanorum, which was invariably attributed to King Louis during the years of his marriage to Eleanor. Indeed, the importance of that title to the French king is shown by the fact that Louis VII continued to employ it until 1154, some years after Eleanor's second marriage. We'll be taking a look at what happened there in a moment. After the wedding, the newlyweds travelled to various parts of their domains to enjoy festivities and to be invested in their royal and noble titles. On the 1st of August 1137, so just a few days after the wedding, while still involved in their travelling festivities, Eleanor's father-in-law died, reportedly of dysentery. Eleanor and Louis were then jointly crowned on Christmas Day 1137. Their marriage produced 2 surviving children, both of whom were daughters. Marie was born in around 1145 and Alice in around 1150. It has been suggested that Marie was not Eleanor's first pregnancy, and that she might have experienced at least one pregnancy loss before this. The lack of a son would become an insurmountable issue for this couple. It would not, though, be the only one. Louis had been compelled, likely with Eleanor's encouragement, to attack and occupy Poitiers, which was a part of her domain and came with her into the marriage. Towards the end of 1137, so soon after Louis and Eleanor had been married, the citizens of Poitiers were displeased at the thought of being subsumed under French rule, and so they declared themselves to be a commune. Well, Eleanor, and no doubt Louis, weren't going to stand for that. However, it might well have looked like Eleanor's problems were becoming Louis's, and thus an Aquitanian issue was being fought by French troops. And certainly, the marriage did have those who opposed it in the kingdom and the territories of the French king. As early as 1143, their consanguinity was being presented as a reason that their marriage should perhaps be annulled. As, quote, Louis VII and Eleanor were cousins to the 4th, 5th and 6th canonical degrees, and in at least 3 different ways. They were, it could be argued, simply too closely related. As to what might have motivated people to go in search of these apparent impediments to this marriage, that may perhaps be explained through the reports that seem to point to Eleanor having angered some of her husband's advisers by meddling too much in affairs of state, at least as they saw it. When the Pope called upon the faithful to mount a second crusade in 1145, Louis VII announced that he was willing to answer this call. Alison Weir states that Louis's plans received a, quote, lukewarm response from the barons of France and Aquitaine. This dismayed chatter from some quarters grew only the louder when Eleanor announced that she too meant to take up the cross and go with Louis, and bring with her the substantial retinue of fighting men who would answer her call. She was going to go on crusade in the summer of 1147. This campaign did, though, not begin well. The crusading forces from France suffered heavy losses in Anatolia. Later commentators have suggested that Louis may have lacked the necessary grit for military leadership, while his wife Eleanor would seemingly show herself to be a prudent strategist. In response to their military strife, the decision was made to travel to Antioch in the hopes of being able to regroup there and relaunch their crusade. When there, they would meet with Eleanor's paternal uncle Raymond, as he was ruling in Antioch. He hoped that his nephew by marriage Louis would be convinced to join him in his planned attack on Aleppo. Louis was, though, determined to proceed to Jerusalem, as he had planned. While they were in Raymond's company, it was noticed that Eleanor was spending a lot of time conversing with her uncle, which, on the face of it, surely isn't that unusual. However, as I did previously mention, Eleanor already had her detractors, and so before long, rumours were being spread about there being an inappropriate degree of closeness between uncle and niece. It has been suggested that Louis was jealous of his wife, of her capabilities, furious that she sided with her uncle's plans for the crusade, and suspicious of the time that she spent in discussion with Raymond. Eleanor, for her part, was apparently thoroughly fed up with Louis, and she demanded an annulment. At this time, Louis was not willing to countenance an annulment, and presumably he also wanted any news of her request or demand to be blocked from being spread, and so he removed her from Antioch. Apparently she wasn't keen on going, but she was compelled. Either way, whatever he might have hoped, the damage was done. Reports of the rift between the royal couple spread, and it was soon being explained by some as having been a result of Eleanor's inappropriate affections for her uncle. This, though, would not be the only time that gossip swirled around that would paint Eleanor as a sexually insatiable adulteress, because in addition to her uncle Raymond, other alleged lovers that she was supposed to have consorted with were Geoffrey of Anjou. He's the father of Henry II of England, about whom more in a moment, but suffice to say, if such a sexual relationship had indeed occurred between Geoffrey and Eleanor, that would, by the standards of the time, have potentially made her subsequent marriage to Geoffrey's son Henry incestuous. Another rumour involved everyone's history crush, the greatest knight himself, William Marshal, while another asserted that Saladin had succumbed to her charms. Most scholars agree that these liaisons never really happened. Instead, in every case, the rumours served a purpose, principally to challenge the authority and or place of Eleanor and her descendants. The remainder of the French royal party's time on Crusade was also as unsuccessful as the start had been, and this royal marriage was apparently irreversibly damaged too, by a number of factors, including the lack of sons, Eleanor's unpopularity with certain members of her husband's court, her seeming willingness to dispute and argue with her husband on matters of strategy, and on top of that, her rumoured adultery with her uncle Raymond. The breach in this marriage was sufficient for the Pope to intervene, to attempt to reconcile Eleanor and Louis. This clearly worked well enough, as this couple's second and final daughter was born in 1150, meaning she was likely conceived after their return from Crusade. The reconciliation was not to last, and even though the Pope had previously forbidden the discussion of Eleanor and Louis's consanguinity, that would be the reason that was settled upon by the ecclesiastical authorities for the annulment of their marriage, which would be announced in 1152. In the aftermath, Eleanor returned to Aquitaine. She was subject to attempts to ambush and kidnap her, that she might be forcibly married to her kidnapper, which would in turn allow that kidnapper to take control of her duchy of Aquitaine. And perhaps that's why, just a couple of months after her marriage to Louis had been formally annulled, Eleanor, who was by then aged around 30, entered willingly into her next marriage with the new Duke of Normandy and Count of Anjou, the 19-year-old Henry. They had apparently met the previous August in Paris, when, of course, she was still very much married to Louis. Henry, through his mother, the Empress Matilda, had a claim to the English throne that in due course he would manage to enforce recognition of. Eleanor, for her part, brought Aquitaine to this marriage, which then combined with Henry's territories, Normandy and Anjou. Altogether, this represented control of more French land than that held by the French king. Perhaps unsurprisingly, Louis was not best pleased with this development, and so he made allies out of Henry's enemies, and there were a few of them, including Henry's own brother, Geoffrey of Anjou, the English King Stephen, his son Eustace, the man who was betrothed to Eleanor's eldest daughter by Louis, he was Henry, Count of Champagne, and Louis's brother Robert, Count of Perche. Henry was, though, able to see off these challenges, so much so that by the start of 1153 he was ready and able to take his forces to England, to make good on his claim to the English throne, at least as he saw it. And there was more good news. Towards the end of 1152, Eleanor had fallen pregnant, and she gave birth to this couple's first son, William, in the August of 1153. Then a few months later, King Stephen was compelled to come to terms with Henry. He did so at Winchester. At that time, he adopted Henry as his heir. The following year, in the October of 1154, Stephen died. Eleanor was crowned Queen of the English in a joint coronation ceremony with Henry at Westminster Abbey on the 19th of December, 1154. Eleanor would go on to have 7 more children. In February 1155, Henry, later known as Henry the Young King, was born. Matilda came next, born in 1156. Their elder brother William sadly died in the December of that same year, when he was just 3 years old. In 1157, Richard, later Richard I, was born. Geoffrey arrived in 1158. Eleanor in 1161. Joanna, also known as Joan, in 1165. And John in 1166 or 1167. One of Eleanor's biographers, Jane Martindale, warns against underestimating Eleanor and the role she played in running the Angevin Empire. Quote, "Despite her recurrent pregnancies, Eleanor played an active part in the government and administration of the English kingdom, for which documentary evidence is more abundant than for any other region. And her itinerary seems often to have been designed to complement her husband's. Evidence of her involvement can be located in the negotiations around the betrothals of her children, approving the movements of people in and out of the royal court, ecclesiastical appointments, various legal matters, and in the exercise of royal authority. It would seem that the early years of this royal marriage might best be categorised as a success, a union between two powerful, ambitious and skillful people who sat at the head of a frankly enviably large empire, a relationship that was close enough that 8 children would be born, 7 of whom would survive into adulthood. And while there has been a tradition for denouncing Eleanor as a bad mother, that is something that has been challenged and reassessed more recently. There is evidence that points to her being a mother who kept her young children close, even during the standard travels of the royal court of that time. And certainly as adults, the evidence we have shows that her children, by both of her marriages, supported her and also turned to her for advice and for company. Nevertheless, this is a family that is perhaps best remembered, and arguably rightly, for its dysfunction. After all, in 1173, King Henry II reportedly heard that his sons, and by his sons I think we're just talking about the ones who would have been in their mid to late teens, were plotting against him. When Henry, the young king, as he had been styled since 1170, heard that his father had heard this, he responded, I think making him look fairly guilty, by fleeing to the court of Louis VII. Now, for those keeping track, Louis VII is, of course, his mother's first husband, but this Louis was also Henry the Young King's father-in-law, as Henry had been married to Margaret, Louis's daughter, by his second wife in 1160. According to the chronicler Benedict, who was the abbot of Peterborough, Eleanor was being alleged by some to have played a key role in fomenting the deplorable betrayal of her husband by her children. And writers from later centuries, William Shakespeare included, would position her as the corrupter of her sons. In later centuries, historians would explain her complicity, even her planning, by suggesting that Eleanor had grown exasperated by Henry's interference in Aquitaine, with how her power was being curtailed there. It has also been suggested that her rebellion was motivated by her husband being unfaithful, and by her jealousy over his lover, Rosamond Clifford. However, as Sarah Cockerell explains, quote, even Henry's own pen for hire, Peter of Blois, never accuses Eleanor of rebellion, or even of encouraging the uprising. His only complaint was that Eleanor remained in Poitou and didn't rush to her husband's aid. At most, the evidence suggests that after the rebellion had started, Eleanor assisted her younger sons to escape Henry's lands, and then refused to deliver herself up to her husband. To be a slight contrarian, which is something I enjoy doing, I would just point out that although Peter of Blois avoiding any mention of Eleanor being involved or inciting this rebellion is compelling evidence to point to the fact that she may not have done, it is also just possible that this was omitted to make Henry look better. In Christendom, a man was supposed to be head of the household. If a man's wife acted without his consent and against his best interests, then perhaps one might question how well his headship was working. This only becomes the more problematic when that man also happens to be the king, and thus head of a nation. If he can't control his wife, if he can't control his children, how on earth can he control a country? Either way, Henry II was unwilling to tolerate Eleanor remaining at liberty. At the start of 1174, she was captured, returned to England, and imprisoned there. Little is known of how she would spend the next decade or so, in what condition she was housed, or even where she was kept for sure. The evidence where it does pop up is scant. The source is tantalising, but few. Geoffrey of Vigeois, who was a chronicler from Aquitaine, mentioned Eleanor being imprisoned at Salisbury. Also, when her eldest surviving son, Henry the Young King, lay dying in the summer of 1183, it is reported that he begged for his mother to receive better treatment, perhaps an indication that she was not being treated all that well. The following year, new and expensive clothing was purchased for the Queen, and she was permitted to meet with her daughter Matilda and Matilda's husband, who was known as Henry the Lion, when they visited England. It's presumed that this new clothing indicates that Eleanor was to be included in the ceremonial, public and visible parts of this visit. Nevertheless, it would not be until 1185, in the aftermath of the death of King Henry II, that Eleanor's by that point eldest surviving son Richard succeeded his father, and at once ordered the release of his mother from prison. He gave her the power to act in his stead and on his behalf in the governance of England, as well as restoring her to all the lands and the revenues that had been seized from her after 1173 during her son's rebellion. Martindale writes that, quote, "The last 15 years of Eleanor's life fully reveal her extraordinary abilities as a ruler. From the start of Richard's reign, before he had arrived in England, Eleanor, by then aged around 67, travelled around, taking oaths of fealty on her son's behalf. She later acted for him in England when he returned to his crusading, but during that period, various matters would draw her away from England, like accompanying Richard's future wife, Berengaria of Navarre, to Messina. She also travelled on diplomatic missions, like the one where she tried to smooth the way for Richard to be released after he was taken hostage by the Duke of Austria. Her diplomacy was made all the more complex because her other son, John, had taken the opportunity to rebel against his brother Richard. Still, there were clearly few, if any, hard feelings because she would support and work towards the reconciliation of her sons in 1194. With this truce between her sons duly achieved, a truce that would hold for the remainder of Richard's reign, Eleanor, who was by then in her early 70s, retired to the Abbey of Fontevraud. However, in 1199, when she learned that Richard had been wounded and was unlikely to live, she left Fontevraud, back on her journeys once again, this time to reportedly be by Richard's side as he died. She then returned to her work, leaving behind her retirement as she sought to secure the inheritance and the reign of Richard's successor, her youngest son, John. For example, she attempted to regain the favour of those who had been annoyed or dispossessed by Richard. She did this by reversing his acts against them. And evidently, John recognised the value of showing himself to be closely allied with his mother, because soon after his accession, he and Eleanor travelled around Aquitaine, doing what they could to secure the favour of the aristocratic, clerical, and lay communities of the regions. If we return to Martindale, she points out that from this point, quote, Queen Eleanor finally ceased direct intervention in English affairs. She never again crossed the Channel, and despite the voyage to Castile in 1200, does not seem to have revisited Normandy after the winter of 1199. By contrast, her involvement in the political affairs of Aquitaine persisted until the very end of her life. She also undertook a military defensive role that sought to see off her grandson Arthur, who was the son of John's elder brother Geoffrey, by his wife Constance of Brittany, from destabilising John's hold on his dominions. This situation reached its zenith in the summer of 1202, when Eleanor found herself trapped at Mirabeau. She was unwilling to surrender, and she held out instead for reinforcement from John. That reinforcement would arrive on the 1st of August. At that point, Eleanor was rescued. Arthur and his key supporters were placed into John's custody. Arthur would disappear in 1203, and it was rumoured that he had been killed either at John's command or perhaps by his own hand. Eleanor, by this point around 80 years old, was in failing health. Nevertheless, she continued to work for John's benefit and also on the business of her duchy. She died on the 31st of March 1204 and was buried at the Abbey Church of Fontevraud. There, she joined in burial with her husband Henry II and two of her children, Richard I and Joanna, also known as Joan. So, what do you think of Eleanor of Aquitaine's life and legacy? What impression did you have of her both before and after watching this video? On that note, and before we finish, I think it's going to be valuable for me to share the following quotation from Sarah Cockerell. Quote, "There has been a tendency to project back into Eleanor's earlier life the same level of power that she enjoyed in her golden years, when there is little evidence to sustain that theory. Eleanor was a remarkable woman, but the roles she performed through her long and eventful life were far from unconventional." As always, I'm looking forward to reading your conversations in the comments section underneath this video. I'd also love it if you pop an emoji or a social glyph in the comments too, because that will boost the engagement, get this video shared out more, and hopefully help us to grow our community. I think I'm going to say pick whichever emoji you think best fits Eleanor. And do also write why you've picked what you've picked, because apparently that will keep the algorithm pixies the most happy. You can find me elsewhere on social media. I will leave links to the place you can find me on the internet in my description box. Please do follow me over on some or all of those so we can continue this conversation and start some others. I do hope you enjoyed this video and found it useful. If you did, please share it with your friends. If you like the channel, let some pals know about it. You can tell me about this video in particular by hitting the thumbs up. Please do subscribe to the channel. If you think you are subscribed, have a check now, just to make sure that you've not been mysteriously unsubscribed against your will. And while you are there, checking, subscribing, maybe resubscribing, please do hit the bell icon beside the subscribe button and then select all in the drop-down that will appear. And that way YouTube claims they will tell you when I've next uploaded, but also when I will next be going live, which I do once a month currently to discuss the history news. Lots of you lovely people send me articles relating to history in the news, whether that's new exhibitions, people misbehaving at heritage sites, new finds, all sorts of good things like that. And of course, our repatriation news. At the moment, it is going for around about 2.5 hours. It's a good time, and I don't think you're going to want to miss it. We have, of course, got our failsafe. If you head over to my website, which will be linked, it is www.katrinamarchant.com. And then if you go to the contact page and put your email address in the box you will see there, hit sign up. That will add you to my list, so I can send you out an email once a week to let you know what I've been up to, but also to send you useful links for my content for the coming days. I hope you're all going to have a great day, whatever you're doing, and I look forward to speaking to you all in my next video. Take care of yourselves. Bye-bye for now.